Hello, I am Eleanor LeCain here with Daniel Ellsberg. Most of you know Dan Ellsberg as the hero who released the Pentagon Papers, secret documents that revealed the government was lying to the American people about the Viet Nam War. His courageous act 50 years ago helped end the Vietnam War. He wrote a compelling memoir, The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. In the memoir, he explains that when he copied the Pentagon Papers, he also copied secret documents about nuclear war planning. He recently released details of those secret plans to use nuclear weapons in an attempt to prevent catastrophe today. We're going to discuss that real and present danger and what we can do about it now. Welcome, Daniel Ellsberg.
Glad to be here, Eleanor. You're a long friend and happy to have this conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. So I would like to begin with, this is not just a history lesson. This is very much current events of what's happening. And you just released, I believe it was May 22nd in the New York Times, documents that showed both how close the US came to using nuclear weapons in 1958 during a dispute with China, and the concern that the thinking and the plans around nuclear weapons may still very much be in place. So can you tell people what was in those documents that is so concerning?
Well, the headline on the Times that revealed that the documents implied that we were very close to war. And that's a little misleading, because the more I learn about this, and I've learned a lot in the last month, just because of the Taiwan crisis that is shaping up right now. So I've been informing myself on it, and that's why I revealed these documents, because they're so relevant. What they revealed back in, the study was actually done in the mid-60s, but it was about a 1958 nuclear crisis. And what they reveal is not so much that we were close to war, because in retrospect, it appears Mao Zedong, who was the leader at that time, had no intention of going to war, no desire. His shelling of these islands, some of which were just 2 miles or 1.2 miles off the coast of mainland China, and were considered by both the Taiwan leadership, the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist leadership, both of them considered part of China, both the offshore islands and Taiwan itself, 90 to 100 miles away from China, were considered one China, part of China. That was the attitude that both took. Now, Mao, as I say, we now know, though it wasn't clear at the time at all, was not intending really to take those islands. He was taking actions and said that they had an intention, but actually at the time it appears didn't have that intention. So in that sense, we weren't close to war. Mm-hmm. What the documents show is, though, that the American officials, starting with Eisenhower and down, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, did believe that the Chinese were on the verge, and we, that is the US side, were determined to keep that from happening, and can only assure that by using tactical nuclear weapons, not merely threatening them, but actually using them on the mainland of China itself. And that Eisenhower had the expectation, which again in retrospect seems doubtful, but at the time believed that the Soviets would live up to their alliance with Communist China at that time and respond to our nuclear weapons by hitting Taiwan with nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons, and also American bases in Guam and Okinawa. Now, that would have defined general war in the Eisenhower period. Any armed conflict with the Soviet Union at that time had one plan for our involvement, and that was for all-out general war against both China and the Soviet Union, in which we would hit every city in China and in Soviet Union. We regarded it as one Sino-Soviet target system, which would, with fallout and other effects, radiation, explosive fire, would cause some 600 million dead at that point in the world by our attacks. And that would include, without even counting in the Soviet response to Europe, for example, against which they had hundreds of short-range and medium-range missiles in plain sailing. Even without counting that, our own attacks would have killed 100 million people in West Europe from fallout from our attacks in East Europe and in Europe, and then another 100 million in East Europe itself, which we regarded as the captive states under the Soviet Union. We would have killed 100 million people there, and 100 million in contiguous states to Soviet Union and China, in which we would kill in Soviet Union and China over 300 million people. We're talking about a total of 600 million dead, 100 Holocausts, as I saw it when I became aware of these estimates in 1961, working on war plans for the White House and for the Secretary of Defense at that time. But now going back to 58, Eisenhower was contemplating actually that kind of war, although in the study that I released, it didn't go that far. It only talked about the immediate regional conflict that would ensue, and there he did expect war with the Soviet Union as a result. What I'm saying is that these plans, especially in the part that they have somewhat understandably chosen not to declassify to this day, 50 years later, more than 50 years, they're still top secret as far as I know, when I released them a couple of weeks ago. What they really reveal is a kind of insanity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was insane planning.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, well, is that some forgotten epoch in which our statesmen had lost track of reality? It's true to some extent, except the same thing is true today. We're talking about initiating nuclear war, possibly in connection with Taiwan, again, in the defense of Taiwan. Also in other parts of the world, Ukraine, the Baltic states, whatever. We insist, we the US, insist on a first use threat policy, which has been the basis of NATO from its beginning. That if any part of NATO, talking now about Europe, should be attacked by the Soviet Union, we're prepared to respond by blowing up the world, essentially. That's the protectorate we establish. You can call that a protector. Well, the threat is is deterrent, as a matter of fact. It is protecting them from any possible attack, however unlikely or likely that might be, but at the cost of preparing to annihilate most of humanity. So it has an element of, more than an element, of insanity. I'm hedging on the terms here because you could say that the people who planned this then and now are not recognizably clinically insane. In fact, they look just like us, just like everybody you meet. They look like ordinary humans, and pretty much the same as now. To say, for example, that our statesmen now are of a higher order of wisdom or intelligence than Eisenhower or Dulles or the Joint Chiefs is wishful thinking. It would be nice, now that we know what they were planning, we would like to think that we're not planning like that anymore. And to some extent, we aren't. For instance, we're really unlikely to blow up the world over the offshore islands a mile or two from China, as we were 50 years ago when the Chinese had no nuclear weapons, by the way. It was a different world to some extent. And the reality was that the Soviets had almost none compared to us. That changed a long time ago, 10 years after that. Now we're planning, I don't say we're threatening it openly, but we are opening the possibility of initiating nuclear war, not over the Quemoy and Matsu, a mile from China, but over Taiwan, 100 miles from China. Is that less insane? Oh, maybe a little bit, but not much. The truth is that in a world in which China has hundreds of nuclear weapons and Russia, even depleted, no more Warsaw Pact, but Russia has thousands, as we do, it's actually, it should be totally ruled out as an option that we threaten, prepare, ready ourselves, exercise, possess even the capability for an all-out nuclear war, for a doomsday machine, essentially, that would destroy, if not all life on Earth, probably, not even all human life, but 90% of it, or perhaps 99%. Now, 1% nowadays, compared to 50 years ago, is a lot of people. 7.8 billion people on the earth. So 1%, you've got 70 million people. It's a lot. Down in New Zealand or shores of Australia eating mollusks and fish as a result of a nuclear winter brought on by an all-out nuclear war, famine. But 90% are gone. 7 billion are gone. It's not something we are preparing for it right now. The Biden budget right now is very heavily addressed to having the ability to disarm the ICBMs, the command and control, land-based targets in Russia, which will not destroy their submarines, which are by themselves able to bring on nuclear winter. In other words, this is a totally delusional kind of expenditure, which does support threats. If we look crazy enough to think that we can reduce damage by striking first in a nuclear war, a preemptive attack, and we show every sign of doing that. Biden is pursuing the Obama and Trump programs of spending nearly $2 trillion over the coming years to improve our preemptive, damage-limiting, accurate, fast missiles and submarines and so forth. If we're crazy enough to spend $2 trillion doing that, we might well be crazy enough to carry out our threats. That's the way it looks. And that's deterrent. That makes people step somewhat cautiously around us. It does not guarantee that the war does not start. And in that case, we are totally poised, ready, prepared, everything else to blow the world up. That's a
The thing that I found most striking about the documents that you revealed last month was the insight into the actual conversation at the table as US decision makers are trying to figure out how do we deal with the fact that China is making a move for these islands. As you point out, these islands that was the source of conflict just over a mile off the coast of China. So it's China would be forgiven for thinking it was connected and wanting to have some influence on it. But the thing that really struck me was in the conversation among the decision makers, it was like watching a Dr. Strangelove movie that they actually, and I mean like the Secretary of State, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they're talking, well, yes, of course, these tiny little islands are insignificant to the United States. We don't really care about them, but we do want to make sure that the United States doesn't look weak, and we care about Taiwan, we care about saving face, and if we're going to have a presence, we don't have the money and the resources to have a conventional war that far away. So in that frame of mind, the use of nuclear weapons seemed like a logical choice, and they were actually planning and ready to do it, right?
Exactly. You read those very well. I mean, you got the idea there, I think, better than some people do reading them. That's absolutely right. You know, you may have heard me quoted as having said back in '64 when I took an afternoon off from the Pentagon with my boss, Harry Rowan, to go see Dr. Strangelove in DC. We came from the Pentagon and came out of that saying, we've just seen a documentary. Because, you know, in every aspect of that, including the inane, you know, and mad kind of dialogue that was going on, we'd heard that kind of thing in the Pentagon. Now, right now, as you say, this study, which was by Mort Halpern back in 1966, 2 years after I'd seen Dr. Strangelove, it has lines in it that you don't usually see in a government study, you know, actual quotations, or even a historical study. Take, for example, the head of Pacific Air Command, Lawrence Cooter, General Cooter, saying that he was prepared to limit our use of nuclear weapons to the immediate vicinity to start with of Quemoy on Chinese airfields and gun emplacements, to limit them to 10 to 15 kiloton weapons, very small by the standards of 1958. These would have been atomic weapons the same as Hiroshima. So he's talking about these small Hiroshima-sized weapons, compared to which we had thermonuclear weapons, H-bombs by then, 1,000 times more powerful. So we don't use those right away. We just use these in order to prevent some misguided humanitarian, quote, exactly, from limiting us entirely to obsolete iron bombs, high explosive, and hot lead, he said. Now, this colorful language could have been, of course, by Terry Southern or Stanley Kubrick, the writers, screenwriters of Dr. Strangelove. It sounds exactly like a line from General Buck Turgidson or Ripper, Jack the Ripper, what was he called?
Yeah.
In that movie. But this is the way they talked and thought. Now, had they been saying, of course we can't do this, but let's hold up the specter of it, let's keep it ambiguous, as we do to a certain extent on Taiwan today.
Mhm.
Let's just make it a threat. Well, you still would have been in the process maintaining a doomsday machine, which is what we're doing now, in order to make these threats. But of course, they were going beyond that. They were saying, let's not use them just for threats, which is a use. Let's launch them if we have to. And to show how this extends right to the present, I just read a Foreign Affairs article just out this month from the Council on Foreign Relations of a woman who appears to be quite knowledgeable, China expert. And she's going over how unpromising all the efforts look to hold on to Taiwan, as I say, 100 miles from China, which China regards, virtually all Chinese regard, as part of China. It's just a matter of their internal affairs. Others can look at it differently. The Taiwanese can look at it differently. But in terms of their willingness to go to war, to keep it from declaring independence, it's rather credible, even in the face of U.S. So she says, okay, the U.S. conventional capabilities are no longer adequate to assure that we can hold it. Back 50 years ago, we could have held Taiwan with conventional capabilities, though not the offshore island. But we could have held Taiwan. Now, not. The war games show that we lose to the Chinese capabilities here. She doesn't use the word nuclear in the whole article, although many other articles about Taiwan nowadays do talk about nuclear. But in this article, no, it's just a difficult problem. We clearly have to hold on to Taiwan. We can't let this democratic nation go under the spell of China, even if both sides agree that it's part of China. And that's true. It's a genuine, difficult, challenging problem. But she does say the conventional won't do it. And you can be sure that when those calculations are made in the Pentagon, people will say, well, we have all these nuclear weapons. And certainly the threat has to be maintained. And how do you maintain it? By sailing ships with, by the way, they don't have nuclear weapons on them right now. George H.W. Bush took them off. I was very happy when that happened at the end of the Cold War. They could go back. And anyway, we have them on Guam, for example, and other places where they could go. As a matter of fact, we have them on Trident submarines now, small nuclear weapons. In fact, 30 kiloton instead of H-bombs. That's only twice Hiroshima. That's what Cooter was talking about 50 years ago. Trump put those weapons on some submarines, and Biden has not taken them off. So we are still right in the very area threatening this. And would we, in fact, allow ourselves to be defeated conventionally without using those? Defeated by a nuclear power, another great power, superpower, unlike Viet Nam, let's say, to allow ourselves to be stalemated by Vietnam or even defeated, as we were, is humiliating and to some extent, but it doesn't affect our power relationships in the world generally. But to be defeated by Russia or China or something, we haven't been tested on that, and I don't want us ever to be. I'll just say, by the way, one definite aspect of policy here. Biden does appear to be moving toward, by encouraging, as Trump did, and to some extent even Obama, encouraging the Taiwanese to declare independence. He's receiving the highest level visits. We're having high level visits back and forth, which we eschewed for some 40 years by agreement with China. And there's great pressure to increase our arms sales, which I think is a major aspect in all of this. Actually selling weapons to Taiwan, believe it or not, I think is a major incentive for our policy here. So we're moving toward, obviously, the more we arm them, and if we were to assure them of our support, absolutely, which Biden hasn't quite yet done, but he's moving toward it. That's crossing a line that Chinese leaders for 70 years, but that's too long. Certainly no less than 40 years have been saying is cause for war. They will use force. They've said that, not just might, if Taiwan actually declares independence and says it's no longer part of China. It would be like Alaska or Hawaii declaring independence, which is not unimaginable these days. What would we do about it? Well, that's a question. China has said what they would do about it. If Taiwan says it's no longer a province of China, it is an independent sovereign state. They said they will go to war. Okay, to me, it looks irresponsible of officials in the Biden administration and of the arms sellers who are pressing for this to be encouraging Taiwan to declare its independence. For all practical purposes, it is independent now. It's autonomous. It has no authority from China. It trades with the whole world, everything else. And it is now a democracy for the last 20 years. For the earlier period, we were supporting a dictatorship no less authoritarian than the communist dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek and his successors. But for the last 20 years, it has been a democracy. It can stay that way, but as I say, it is playing with fire when it does what many Americans are urging it to do right now, and that is to declare independence. I'm saying that's moving into a world now where the U.S. policy, foreign policy, as Dulles put it back in '58, was then and is now based on a threat by the U.S., an assurance to our allies that we will initiate nuclear war in their defense if necessary. And Biden, by the way, is talking about an Asian NATO, which would mean a first use alliance based on U.S. first use threat.
Mm-hmm.
That is a terribly wrong way for the U.S. policy to be going.
Yeah, that's very concerning. Well, that answers maybe a question that I was going to ask you. So I know you talk in your book that you copied these secret documents about the nuclear war planning at the same time you copied the Pentagon Papers, and you understood at the time, I think, that these nuclear war plans were actually far more significant even than the Pentagon Papers. But you released the Pentagon Papers because that was the hot topic, get some attention, deal with that issue, and then the intention was to release these. And yet, for 50 years, you didn't, but
Well,
now you are.
No, that's a little misleading, I may say. Eleanor.
Okay.
As you know, I know you've read my book, The Doomsday Machine, as you mentioned it, Confessions.
Yes.
And I start in there by explaining why the most of the documents that on the nuclear issue that I had felt were more important even than the Viet Nam War, but I meant to release as soon as the war was over.
But they got lost.
But they got lost
in the trash and the garbage. It's like an unbelievable
in
story.
a hurricane that hit New York and moved them in ways that I couldn't recover them. Now, this study was one of a few documents that I had another copy of that didn't get lost. And actually, I have tried at various times to put it out before the advent of the web. No publisher was interested in this. They couldn't sell a book about nuclear war. So I spent all my energy really trying to help build, as you know, with you, a movement like the anti-war, anti-Viet Nam War movement and anti-nuclear movement that would be like the anti-war movement and would move against this. And I relied on that rather than trying to get anybody to put out these documents. With the web, my son was able to put this particular study on the web several years ago, but we didn't get much attention. We didn't draw great attention to it because there seemed to be no Taiwan crisis looming at that point. And I had to turn to that, I had to rethink that in the last month precisely because we're talking about this threat. And it raises the question of our overall policy because this threat of first use of nuclear weapons is raised next to Russia in places like Poland or the Baltics. In the event that diplomacy does not suffice, or our relations with Russia deteriorate so badly that they create a challenge in the Baltics or Poland, those countries want the same kind of assurance that Berlin used to have or West Germany. And that's understandable on their part. The only problem is that means we keep our first strike capability to back up our first use threats. If we carry out tactical use of nuclear weapons, don't think of responding because then we could escalate to a disarming first strike. And we buy the weapons for that. And that's what these intercontinental ballistic missiles, now called ground-based strategic deterrent, that ICBMs basically, the most vulnerable part of our war machine, which have to be launched on warning to survive. And the warning can be false, as it has been a number of times. Fortunately, the false alert have not gone on long enough to get these missiles off the ground, but they have gone to a point where that had to be considered. And that, would mean all-out war based on a false alarm. The same thing applies to Russia, by the way. They've had also false alarms like that. So on both sides, systems like this that make hostage of the entire world to our diplomatic threats and maneuvering like that preceded World War I, for example, that's intolerable, insufferable. It's unconscionable, but it's real. It's what we're doing and what we're funding right now. That has to change, and how to do that is a very challenging problem.
Well, let's talk about that because we're now talking in this World Unity Week with people all over the world who want peace. And almost everybody I know does not want nuclear weapons being used. I think most people just are not aware of how close we can be, either accident or by design, for these weapons to be used. So when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, it was kind of like, hooray, we won, they're gone, end of problem. Not at all. And I was surprised to learn about the doomsday clock that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have set. And they, as you know, set it up to say, this is how close to midnight we are, how close we are to these nuclear weapons being used, and that they now, in this moment, have set the doomsday clock at just 100 seconds before midnight, the closest it's been since it was created in 1947. So even though the circumstances have changed a lot in terms of the US-Soviet Cold War concern, that the danger of a use of nuclear weapon is higher now than it has ever been. Can you speak to that?
Yes, well, of course, that's a judgment by very knowledgeable people, including a lot of military people or officials who have retired. There's something called a retirement syndrome where people seem free to tell what they thought for a long time about the insanity of the plans they were working on when they retired. 39 years I waited for someone, namely Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, to reveal secrets about an ongoing war on the same level, the same scale that I did. And then 3 years after that, Ed Snowden. But the three of us are to be laid against. I think we really should have revelations on that scale about once a year. and it hasn't happened. And so they put the clock that's meant to be a warning. It is a warning. And there's been no perceptible reflection of that in our congressional, actually, I'd say in any country that I can look at. Russia and the US both, where our budget is enormously greater than Russia's or China's. Nevertheless, they're maintaining their ICBMs too, and we are. It hasn't slowed them down at all. So the problem is, which we haven't found yet, is there a way of warning? Now, Eleanor, you and I were part of an effort back in the nuclear freeze campaign in the early 80s that actually did inform people as to what nuclear war actually meant. One part of that campaign, for instance, was that the Physicians for Social Responsibility, PSR, which still exists, still active. By the way, I don't think they're focusing on nuclear war generally as much as they did. That's how they got started. Actually, they were part of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, which got a Nobel Prize. But, as you say, with the Cold War over, people have turned their attention elsewhere. There still is a very large organization, Peace Action, which comes out of sane nuclear policy, and the freeze and other things. So there are indeed anti-nuclear organizations, but they don't have the attention or the support that they did have. Now, the first actually droppable H-bomb that we tested in 1954 released 15 million tons equivalent of TNT, 15 megatons. That was 1,000 times more than the Nagasaki type bomb, which was about 20 kilotons, 1,000 tons, and Hiroshima was about 15,000 tons. So this was 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima, and it was set off by essentially an A-bomb, a Nagasaki type bomb. So I think very few people nowadays understand what changed in the world, in the meaning of war, and even of atomic war, now nuclear war, in the mid-50s, just before the Taiwan Straits crisis, by the way, in 58, when A-bombs were replaced by H-bombs, or to put it another way, they became the detonators for H-bombs. And the threat to humanity as a whole has been with us ever since then, since the mid-50s. And of course, it was latent in the invention of the A-bomb 10 years earlier, which right away the scientists knew this can be the detonator for a much larger weapon. Okay, people know nothing about this. In other words, not to know the difference that I've just described, and I really expect that most of your hearers will not have known. They may know one bomb is bigger than the other, or which one, but how much bigger? What's the difference it makes? It took, after, when I say I discovered that we were planning on 600 million if we launched our war plans in 61 under Kennedy, Eisenhower war plans. 20 years after that, we learned something else that had never been figured, an effect of these bombs that no one had calculated. And that was that the smoke that they would loft from a burning city, which they would set afire by a firestorm caused by one of these even small bombs like Hiroshima, would be lofted into the stratosphere where it wouldn't rain out. And that probably happened with Hiroshima, but it was only one bomb. 200 cities, 100 to 200 cities, providing kindling for smoke that these bombs would loft by an updraft into the stratosphere, would not rain out, and it would surround the globe very quickly, within days or a week. And it would cut out most of the sunlight, 70% of the sunlight, creating ice age conditions on the Earth, winter conditions all year round.
Make it impossible to grow food.
Killing all harvests. And that's what I was referring to earlier. Many people may not have picked up when I use the term nuclear winter or famine. That's what comes from a large war nowadays. And a war against a non-nuclear state like Iran might not have that effect. It wouldn't. Iran has no nuclear weapons like China in '58, so it would be a nuclear war that would, on our part, that would kill millions, but it wouldn't explode into an all-out war necessarily. Now, war against North Korea, which has only 40 weapons or so right now, would be much larger, but again, might not cause nuclear winter. But when we're talking about war with China or Russia, or between India and Pakistan right now, you're talking about annihilation of the world. And the question arises, not only do we, the nuclear state making these threats, have the right to threaten or possibly kill nearly everyone else, all the other states, uh, it seems to answer itself. Of course, no one has that right to be threatening, let alone carrying out the threats. So I repeat what I said earlier. We should not, no nation should be threatening, preparing, exercising, possessing the means to cause nuclear winter or to initiate nuclear war. When we talk about no first use, which does have a bill for it by Adam Smith, the actual current chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. That sounds promising. He has a bill for no first use. The U.S. shall not initiate nuclear war. He's the chairman. But he has a 59-member committee. Most of them don't agree with that. How could that be? Did we want to do it? Well, it's very profitable for the aerospace industry to build the weapons for such threats. In other words, to prepare for such a war, even though the war would be far greater than the Holocaust. It wouldn't be just genocidal. It wouldn't be just multi-genocidal. It would be closer to being omnicidal, killing everything. Not quite.
Right.
But preparing for that is profitable, and it keeps us as the leading protector of a lot of nations, including NATO in particular, but also in Asia, Japan, and we're moving toward that kind of assurance to Taiwan.
So, Dan, I have to ask you, because you're so brilliant and you know so much. I want to talk like, what do we do about this? And what do you see? Like, we need to get rid of nuclear weapons once and for all. Where do you see the points of leverage? What action can we take that would shift this problem of nuclear weapons, both within the United States and globally? Do you have any ideas what we do about it?
Yes. Of course, the ignorance I've talked about can, in principle, be countered. As I say, it was 40 years ago. People were knowledgeable about it, and that actually was a considerable pressure, including the possibility of nuclear winter, on Reagan and Gorbachev, who actually did agree on eliminating a whole class of weapons, the intermediate range nuclear weapons, which, by the way, had just been moved to Taiwan in '57. That was a Matador missile. That was one of the precipitating aspects of the Chinese concern in '58, but which we had them in the '80s and so forth. We got rid of those essentially by public pressure and by Reagan and Gorbachev understanding these nuclear winter aspects, which had just become known in '83, just before they met. They've been lost, essentially. I think very few people have remembered what that was about. And as you say, they thought it had gone away with the Cold War ending. Two problems with that. The weapons didn't go away. They basically should have. Reagan and Gorbachev at Iceland, at Reykjavik, actually discussed for an hour or two eliminating nuclear weapons. It's the only time in the 70 years of the nuclear era when one or two, let alone two, world leaders, and one of them being Reagan, to give him credit, actually did take the problem seriously and discuss this. It's the only time it was ever discussed. With the Cold War ending a few years later with Russia, that was an opportunity for really moving ahead. But instead, the U.S. said, now we're the sole remaining superpower, and we don't want to give up this instrument. Though it was, as it remained, and Putin built them up again. pretty much Russian, as a seems like prestige or domestic reasons. He has his own military industrial complex now that it's a capitalist country, exactly like ours. So we come back, okay, education would be a major factor here. And groups like Peace Action or support for Adam Smith's no first use bill, and I think Senator Markey and Ted Lieu of Congress have introduced similar legislation. Unlikely to pass, but it is educational to support it and move forward and say, here's why it should pass. Why won't it? Well, the next thing is we have to recognize what I'm not sure we did during the freeze movement, the corporate influences as well as military service that want the status quo. They want to provide these weapons. They want to renew them. They make money. There are jobs involved in almost every district in the union. That gives Congress people incentive to keep the programs going along with the campaign donations that they get. So I think, again, recognizing that our efforts to save the world here in the long run are opposed by corporations we can name, actually, and could be challenged directly. Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. You can look at a library like that behind me, all on nuclear weapons, and look at the indices for any of those names. And they're not there, so they weren't influences on the political process. Actually, they're enough to keep it going. So I think efforts on that, on the influence that these companies have, specifically companies, and by the way, on the actual officials, our current Secretary of Defense, far from the, we've had worse, let's say, but like the others, he went right from the military to the board of directors of Raytheon, one of the top 3 contractors, and we'll go back there essentially after he's Secretary of Defense. They're intertwined. Third, to understand and begin to oppose the fact that our foreign policy has been based on threatening to initiate nuclear war. That's the basic thing that gives us the superior role in NATO. We're not, after all, a European nation. Why is the commander of NATO always an American? It's not because of the troops we have over there, that's part of it, but because America controls this massive nuclear force, dwarfing France's, for example, or England's. They're members of it, but they don't rely on them to protect the nation. And they couldn't any more than we could by carrying out their nuclear threats. That's a threat of mass. It's not just suicide or homicide, homicide. It's omnicide, a threat that shouldn't be made. And so I think, again, the Taiwan issue, which is coming up partly because Xi's domestic position in China depends on his not allowing this province of China to break away and become a sovereign nation. A domestic reason like that could keep him carrying out his commitments to attack that if that happens. Would that be in the interest of humanity? No. Or of China? Terrible risk. But it's the kind of risk Americans have taken over and over again, mostly without the public knowing it. And then on our side, yes, you could say Taiwan is as deserving of a nuclear first-use threat as people have been in the past. But that was incredibly reckless in the past. It did lead to the maintenance of these doomsday machines. And if we make that commitment to Taiwan now, there's no chance of getting rid of the doomsday machine. It will be, first use remains a key element of U.S. power in the world. And that's bad news for humanity, because there will be obviously no Russian diminution or U.S. without the two together, have got to go down together, and neither Putin nor Biden is moving in that direction now. Obama talked about it, but was influenced to back off by the military-industrial complex, essentially. Trump, of course, didn't even talk about reducing defense, but neither have the Democrats. quote defense. And what we're talking about, I think, indicates the irony of calling this a defense strategy. It is the protection by the threat of and the ability, the readiness to annihilate most life on Earth. Something that should not have existed and should not exist, but it does exist right now. So we should develop a movement then of moving against that. What's the chance of a world, a chance of a tribal feeling among the whole species, the human tribe? We talk about the human family. We don't act that way, except in the worst aspects of family. Families have feuds.
Dysfunctional family.
People in families kill each other from time to time, but it's not enough, as I think Russell and Einstein said, to remember your humanity, because it's humans. Nothing is more human than these kinds of threats. And of course, only in the nuclear era could we make threats of this magnitude. But throughout, for thousands of years, since the agricultural era at least, of civilization with its cities and its classes and its torture and its sexism and its racism and its wars, above all, for the last 4,000 years, now armed with nuclear weapons. What's the chance of changing that pattern? Well, I would say it's not guaranteed, that's for sure. It's not likely, I have to say. It's unlikely to change that, but it's not impossible. And everything depends on that. We've seen nations, we've seen groups turn away from empire, not often, but it has happened. And could it happen again? I repeat, unlikely, but not impossible. And that is that part is up to us. We can't rely on our leaders by themselves to change that. The pressures on them from high, powerful interest groups, just keep them in place on that. If there were a lot more leaders like Gorbachev, for example, really capable of transformational change, the prospects would be different. But we haven't seen that, and waiting for one is not very promising. But those of us who can respond to a willingness to take account of the interests of humanity as a whole, including the ones we regard as others, or an unwillingness to regard others as enemies, who aren't actually attacking us, but who can't be trusted. We can't negotiate. We can't make deals. We can't, coordinate. That's very dangerous. And we are unnecessarily regarding China and Russia in that spirit right now, as though it was the Axis. We talk about them in terms, as though it was the Axis actually attacking us and unwilling to negotiate. That's not the way it is. It's very dangerous to be defining other people as enemies when that is not absolutely necessary or inescapable, and that's what's happening. So can humans then act on their ability to cooperate in ways other than cooperating against an enemy? That has been unfortunately the motive, for nations and for alliances cooperating. We have to find that won't do it. If we have to have an enemy in order to cooperate ourselves, then humanity is doomed in the nuclear era and in the era of climate change. That won't do it. We have to cooperate worldwide and with countries like India and China and Russia and others in Europe, obviously. Brazil, under its current leadership, which is not leading. None of these are leading adequately to a world that can survive with humans. So that's the challenge to us. We know, I think, what the problems are. Well, not as much. We know a lot more about climate than we know in the public, than we know about nuclear weapons, and it doesn't seem to be helping, does it? So that shows,
I think
the problem. But
There's actually a huge movement on the climate. I mean, people
yeah,
are feeling the climate change, and that's where the energy is. When I see the mobilization to deal with the
yeah,
climate crisis, it reminds me of the peace movement in the 80s and the energy and the mobilizing, having 1 million people in the streets in New York saying, get rid of the nuclear weapon. So this is fascinating to me, Dan. I think, yes, we need a reinvigorated peace movement. We need to educate about what the real concerns are, that the problems and the nuclear weapons didn't go away when the Soviet Union went away and the Cold War went away. No, we still have them and trillions of dollars behind it.
yeah.
And we need to let people know and get them moving and mobilized to oppose what is currently our policy and our nuclear weapons practice, our weapons budget, all needs to change. So,
Well, I would point you. You remind me, speaking, Eleanor, of my hero Greta Thunberg, who did bring millions of people into the streets in a strike on a weekday, general
right,
strike, basically on the climate. But to put this in context, Greta, I admire in part for her candor in saying the measure of whether we're going in the right direction is not how many people we have in the streets, but whether emissions are going down. And they're
mhm,
not. She couldn't be clearer on that. In fact, to listen to her, I wouldn't say no indication you go wrong listening to Greta. That doesn't mean then that she's failed, obviously. And by the way, I suspect the pandemic, of course, had a very smothering effect on mass demonstrations, although not Black Lives Matter, and interestingly, that did arrive. All I'm saying is the climate issue, yes, we do have a movement, and it is not affecting Congress to that extent. Now, Biden, we did get rid of Trump. And I'll mention one thing that's practically a miracle. By the way, that wasn't expected to have as much good effect as it is having domestically. And
mhm.
his climate program is obviously, incomparably better in the right direction compared to Trump. So that was a change. Think of what happened in Georgia, where the fact of a white Jewish senator and a black senator being elected in that election after January 6th, after in Georgia, thus giving us 50 members with an independent of Congress, of Senate. I mean, that was like a miracle. And how did that happen? Grassroots organizations, Stacey Abrams and others, with all the people helping her in Georgia, did make a real difference there and give us a chance.
Mhm.
That's what we have. We have a chance. We're not without a chance. To think that it's going to happen, we're sure somebody else will take care of this. No. It's the spirit of, say, Chelsea Manning when it comes, or of Ed Snowden when it comes to revealing classified information. Their spirit, this has to be done, and nobody else is doing it, so I have to do it. That is the spirit. I
Right.
think it
It's
has
up
to be
to
very broad,
us.
very broad. If we, and
Right. I
yeah,
love that. And you mentioned Peace Action is still around, so that's a good group. And the Women's Action for New Directions is still around, WAND, a women's group, which your wife Patricia and I served on the board of that for 20 years. So that is still alive and kicking. So the groups are there. And if any of our people listening today want to connect in, I encourage you to check out Peace or
I guess
Women's Act New
we
Directions.
shouldn't end without saying the magic words common security or cooperative security. What Gorbachev really introduced to the world, what he called a new way of thinking, which has unfortunately gone into disuse. But he said, seeking our security by ways other than reducing the security of others. Seeing that we cannot improve our own security on climate or on nuclear weapons at the cost of other people's insecurity. It has to be together. And humans have shown a capability for great cooperation more than any other species, but not enough yet for this. It's not ruled out that we show more cooperation, even with groups that have different forms of government and ones that we don't agree with or approve of. But there has to be collaboration right now. We can't wait for internal change in all these other countries or ours. We've got to do it with what we have right now. And it implies a kind of human propensity that is we've never seen on a global scale, but we need it more than ever, and it's possible.
So there's our challenge, difficult but not impossible. And you talked about a potential external threat. I was reading recently that when Reagan was talking with Gorbachev, he said, if there were an alien invasion to Earth, you and I would be allies to defend humanity against an attack from aliens. He said, we don't have the alien invasion, but we could act as if we did, and we could work together to make things better for humanity. And I just thought, that's amazing. And of course, we've got next month, or this month, the Pentagon is going to be releasing its UFO report, or they call it unidentified aerial phenomenon now, UAPs. So we're going to see what comes from that. We also want to, along with the no first use, we want to get the no weapons in space. So there's a number of concrete legislation that we could rally behind to kind of move us into the right direction. We need to wrap up now, but before we go, I did want to ask you, I know we just celebrated your 90th birthday, and I am so amazed and impressed that here you are, 50 decades after the Pentagon Papers were released, you're still at it. You're still reading and writing and speaking out and taking action and releasing documents that tell people what we need to know to save life on Earth. Do you have any kind of final comment in this interview about kind of what keeps you going, or kind of what you want your legacy to be?
Well, the unhappy part is the problems haven't changed that much, and they still seem as urgent. And I continue to want life to go on. Not exactly as it has in the way of wars and threats and preparations for war. We need real change there. But in order to get that, I want it all to go on. And the climate problem and the nuclear problem challenge that. So I'm still at it, working against that, on that.
Well,
and I urge other people to join.
Right. Well, I continue to stand with you on this work for peace and stopping nuclear weapons. And I pledge to you, I will continue to my dying day
I know you will.
to work for that peace and for a better world for everybody. So I salute you, and I thank you so much, Daniel Ellsberg, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor. Good to see you.